Picture yourself in London. The year is 1835, and it's drawing toward its end. And this year, you have finally managed to get a ticket to the Royal Society's Christmas lecture series. It's pretty exciting stuff. Mr. Faraday, the founder of the lectures, is speaking on the topic of electricity, something that you associate with lightning and pretty much nothing else. After all, electric lamps won't even be invented for another 40 years, and nothing that you interact with in your daily life makes use of electricity. Now, you've read that these lectures include lots of practical demonstrations, and as you pile into the packed Royal Institute lecture hall, you're curious about the show that Mr. Faraday is going to be putting on, because his reputation as an incredible presenter precedes him, and you want to know how he'll try to amaze you. Mr. Faraday does not disappoint. As he lectures, he brings the room itself to life. Bright blue bolts of energy jump between metal devices on his table, electrifying the crowd. Whatever level of education you may have, be it rudimentary or extensive, Mr. Faraday brings you into his world, showing you the simple, elegant beauty of nature and helping you to understand how it works. Hello all, my name is Mark May. I want to thank Dr. Haas for having me today and thank all of you for coming tonight. So today we've talked a lot about public intellectualism and conversation and the dearth of both of those things that we suffer from in our culture. And I think that chief among the reasons for those problems is the fact that most pioneering intellectual knowledge is wrapped up in the language of the elite of its field. Essentially, it's written by experts for other experts, leaving anyone who wants to get into a field that isn't theirs feeling somewhat illiterate. Information is hidden behind what I would call the wall of jargon, which can be very, very difficult to climb. However, I believe that there is a second reason why so little intellectualism in our culture is public. And it's the fact that we view intellectuals as almost an entirely separate species. And you know the archetype. It's people who sit in their ivory tower, sipping their coffee, discussing moral philosophy or quantum mechanics in just the most pretentious way possible all day. And with the natural sciences in particular, this problem is confounded by the fact that we view science as an autonomous entity rather than as a collection of people. Consider how many headlines you've seen that start with the words "science says" before they go on to misinterpret a nutritional study. I believe that we have lost the human element of science. We've forgotten that every scientific discovery is made by a regular human person, and likely just someone who fell in love with discovery and chased an idea until it led somewhere. We never think about any of that. We lose sight of the fact that the stories of science are fundamentally human. Stories of following a passion, overcoming obstacles, and chasing impossible dreams. Today, I want to tell you one of the most compelling stories in all of science because it defies so many of the tropes that we might expect about the story of a scientific legend. Michael Faraday, the same Mr. Faraday from before, was one of the great experimental physicists the world has ever seen. He was also a skilled lecturer, an ambassador for science, and by all accounts, a good, kind man. So today, I'm going to tell you his story. Michael Faraday was 14 years old when the door slammed shut on his formal education. This wasn't a huge loss, of course. Faraday always had a bit of a difficult time with his studies. He struggled with reading and with speaking and was shy because of it. His spelling and punctuation were poor, he had difficulty remembering things, and he had no skill for mathematics. In fact, Thomas West, an author who specializes in books about dyslexia and those who suffer from it, believes that Michael Faraday exhibited all the typical symptoms of a dyslexia patient. And whatever the cause of Faraday's difficulties, they made him a poor student. Furthermore, Faraday's family was desperately poor. When he was born in 1791, Faraday's father was a blacksmith who had no work. And with his family strapped for resources throughout his life, young Michael needed to begin working as soon as possible. So with only the most basic reading, writing, and arithmetical skills, his education in school came to an end. Now, the trope of the scientist who studies hard but struggles in school has become a bit of a tired one. You've probably all heard the story of how Einstein failed his high school math class, which is not the case. But Faraday is the true, real instance of that archetype. And with only the barest education, Michael Faraday began an apprenticeship with a London bookbinder and bookseller. While working for the bookbinder, Faraday displayed one of the quintessential traits of the successful scientist: curiosity. He read, as the story goes, every science-related book in that shop. And remember, this is a man who many have studied and many believe that he had dyslexia. So reading this many books could not have been an easy process for him. But he kept at it because he wanted to learn and nothing was going to stand in his way. When he was 15, Faraday read Jane Marseille's brilliant Conversations on Chemistry, an introduction to science as a subject of wonder and of beauty. Marseille wrote introductory books across a huge range of subjects, from economics to philosophy to botany. And by the way, I would love to see any book that could convince me that economics is a study in wonder and beauty. Still waiting on it. Marseille's goal was to fascinate and to tug at her readers' natural curiosity and pull them into a world that they had never seen before. You can imagine Marseille as the Aladdin to young Michael Faraday's Jasmine. She brought him into a whole new world. Thanks to her, Faraday learned that some of the scientific world could be understood without the mathematical formalism that was so difficult for him. He came to learn that the natural world could be understood in a hands-on, visual, practical way. And for someone whose job gave him countless hours practicing working with his hands, binding books, this was a very appealing way to consider science. Marseille's writings were Faraday's natural first foray into the scientific world. Now, when Michael Faraday was 22, the world of science formally opened its doors to him. After reading Conversations on Chemistry, Faraday dug deeper into the scientific world and began to attend public lectures, any that he could afford. Because of his poor memory, Faraday developed the habit of writing down anything that he was trying to learn and anything that he was working on. And this habit would pay off for him down the road when he attended a series of lectures by Sir Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institution. Davy was a titan in chemistry at his time. He discovered and isolated a whole host of chemical elements, and he was one of the most dynamic personalities in 19th century science, for whatever that was worth. Famously, Davy did an experiment on nitrous oxide while trying to learn about some of its properties, and he decided that the best way to figure out more about the chemical was inhaling it. Fortunately, this did not kill him. Instead, it made him laugh uncontrollably. And his nickname for the substance, laughing gas, has stuck to this day. Now, Faraday was taken by the dynamic lecturing of Sir Humphrey Davy. And after attending a couple of lectures, he sent Davy hundreds of pages of his notes from those lectures, along with a request for a job. Now, Davy was duly impressed by the notes, and a few months later, he had an accident in his lab while working with nitrogen trichloride, which scarred his eyes and blurred his vision permanently. From there, he decided that he needed a technical assistant, someone who could handle the day-to-day jobs of the laboratory and take care of tasks that were just too difficult for him to bother with. And Humphrey Davy knew exactly where to turn. Michael Faraday got his job with Humphrey Davy by displaying one of his most important traits, a willingness to try anything, even completely ridiculous ideas that seemed destined to fail. Faraday was more than willing to flout convention, both social and scientific. And a willingness to work against the grain is a key characteristic for any scientist who is to be truly revolutionary and push our understanding of the world to places that it has never been before. I think we can all learn from this trait of Faraday's. Sometimes if you have a crazy idea, it's best to just go for it and send those 300 pages of notes to your idol. What could really go wrong? In 1813, with a mind bent on discovery, dexterity honed by years of practice, and a dogged determination to figure out as much as he could about the world, Michael Faraday joined the lab of Sir Humphrey Davy. Michael Faraday was 34 years old when the rest of his life began. He quickly learned, while working with Davy, that his time in that lab was going to be a baptism by fire. Davy was famously one of the more difficult personalities in all of British science at the time. As an example of the type of behavior he often exhibited toward his technical assistant, shortly after Faraday was hired, Davy set out on a 2-year voyage touring different labs across Europe, and his valet refused to make the trip. So Michael Faraday, who was originally scheduled to join Davy on the journey as a technical assistant, was instead forced to serve as his valet for the entire 2-year trip. Now, though they often butted heads, understandably, Faraday really burst onto the scientific scene while he was working for Davy. And he quickly developed great acumen for both experimental physics and for chemistry. Now we're going to pull up some visual aids of some of the things that he was working on at the time. So he isolated benzene, a central substance in organic chemistry, the structure of which is here. Many of you in the audience are currently in organic chemistry. You know all about this structure. Faraday also showed how to liquefy pure chlorine gas for the first time, creating this lovely yellow liquid that you see in front of you. He also showed, on the physics side, that a magnet exerts a force on a wire carrying electric current, which is shown in this figure here. But the importance of this discovery would not be fully understood for a number of years after that. So with Faraday's exemplary work across a huge range of disciplines, he got the attention of the Royal Society. And even though Humphrey Davy preferred to think of him as just a technical assistant, and demanded personal credit for all of Faraday's discoveries, the Royal Institution in 1824 elected Faraday to its ranks. And in 1825, he was made the director of his own laboratory. From there, it was off to the races. In 1831, Faraday discovered that changing a magnetic field near a conductor induces a current in that conductor, which is shown in this figure here. Faraday also found that the electromotive force, that is the voltage that creates that induced current, is exactly equal to the rate of change of magnetic flux in that system. Now, this is a really, really impressive discovery because Faraday did it without any mathematical skill to formalize this finding. This is a physical law that is necessarily expressed with calculus. You can see it formalized up here. Faraday, like so many of us, could not do calculus, and yet he managed to figure this out with just experimentation and visual sense. Now, this law is known as Faraday's law, in honor of the man who discovered it. His brilliance was wrapped up in persistence, in a visual sense of how the world ought to behave, and a willingness to try anything that he thought might work, even if it seemed a little bit ridiculous. The most notable example of this last trait was Faraday's proposal of field lines. That's the idea that invisible lines propagate through space, and that interaction with those lines is what creates electrical or magnetic forces. Now, Faraday's rationale for believing in this was very simple. He could show that the field lines existed. And there is a very simple technique for doing it. All you need is, if we just get to the right spot in the video, all you need is a bar magnet and iron filings. You pour them onto a flat surface, and as you can see here, the filings arrange themselves in a very clear set of lines. Now, Faraday believed that those lines are indicative of something physically real, something about the physical world, but he couldn't mathematically formalize it, and so his colleagues dismissed it out of hand. Faraday's journey through field lines is one of the greatest, perhaps most quintessential examples of his work, because he found something out about the physical world through experiment and intuition that he could not properly mathematically formalize. And unfortunately, Faraday didn't live to see James Clerk Maxwell go back through his work, develop a mathematical description of electrical and magnetic fields, and prove him right. But in the end, it did happen. Michael Faraday's story shows us how human science is. Because before he could make any of the discoveries for which we now remember him, Faraday fought through struggles in school, an overbearing boss, and a complete distaste for mathematics. 3 things that I think all of us can relate to. As he was making his discoveries, he labored over his work and kept trying anything that he thought could lead him to the truth. I think that reducing Michael Faraday's contribution to our world to a couple of chemical techniques and a couple of physical laws misses the central lesson of his life. because Faraday never stopped chasing those discoveries. As an example, later in his career, he became convinced that a link must exist between gravity, electrical, and magnetic forces. Something that tied gravity to those two forces he understood the best and bound the universe together. Now, despite countless experiments, Faraday was never able to figure it out. It does exist, but it took an Einstein to solve that problem, by which I mean the literal Albert Einstein. Now, Faraday went to his grave searching for that link. He never quit and he never stopped. But at the end, he closed his career without having answered every question and without having solved all the problems. He had to pass on the torch to those who came after him, just as we all must, showing again how human the scientific process is. And I have one last note on that. Faraday himself understood that science belongs to the people, to all of us, and he worked very hard to make it accessible to all. Starting in 1825, the same year that he opened his own laboratory, Faraday began a series of Christmas Day lectures, the same ones that we visited at the beginning of this talk. Open to the general public, they were meant to educate people of any level of knowledge about different fields of science and introduce them to science as a field of wonder and of beauty, just like Jane Marcet had done for Faraday so many years before. Those lectures are still running today. They go every year around Christmas time and are internationally broadcast on the BBC. They've hosted all manner of great scientists, and inspired by the spirit of those lectures that Faraday created, as Dr. Haas mentioned before, we have created a podcast that will tell the stories of great scientists throughout history. Now, every one of them was no more and no less than a person chasing his or her ideas. This podcast will be called Stories of Science, and will be available on the Consideration Initiative website, considerationinitiative.com, if any of you are interested in listening. Faraday, of course, hosted more Christmas Day lectures than anyone else in history, covering 19 different years. In 1861, at the end of his career, he gave his final and most famous lecture series, The Chemical History of a Candle. He remained humble and kind throughout his illustrious career, and I think that is his greatest lesson to us. Not any description of the physical world, but the fact that for so much of his time as a scientist, he spent weekends in hospitals to keep the sick company. He declined knighthood on multiple occasions because he didn't believe that chasing earthly awards should be his goal. He remained a good man through it all, and that is the greatest lesson in his humanity. So today I'm going to leave you with his final words from his final lecture in 1861. Indeed, he said, all I can say to you at the end of these lectures, for we must come to the end at one time or another, is to express a wish that you may, in your generation, be fit to compare to a candle. That in all your actions you may justify the beauty of the taper by making your deeds honorable and effectual in the discharge of your duty to your fellow people. Wise words from a wise man. Thank you for your time.